All right, welcome to Deuteronomy 12 and 13, where we're going to see God giving instructions about the place that they will be worshiping. Is this too loud? Does this sound too loud? It's fine? All right, whatever. All right, so just as a reminder, the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 1 through 30, speeches of Moses, 31 to 34 is the succession of Joshua. Can anybody remind us what the word Deuteronomy means? Yeah, giving, same law, giving of the law, second giving of the law, something like that. I was reading a book today that gave me the etymology of the word autonomous, and I had never thought about it before. But the nomo, or the nami part, is law in Greek, and autonomous means to be a self-governing person. It's like you're controlled by your own laws kind of thing, autonomous. It's just an interesting thing, whatever. All right, so the first 5 chapters or so give you a speech from Moses. The first one, which is giving a review of history, what the Lord had done for them, and the response of having to obey him, which gets us into the second speech, which is chapters 5 through 26. Although some people will further subdivide some of this and say that there's 4 speeches or something like that. But in the section we're looking at right now, we're transitioning where we're looking backwards to what the Lord has done, and now looking forward to warnings for when they get into the land. There were some warnings about when they get into the land in like chapter 8, for example, but the main thrust of what we're looking at now is when you get into the land, here are some things that you need to be aware of. Now, I want to begin just by asking this question, because this question will bear on what we're looking at in Deuteronomy chapter 12. But where was the place that Israel was to worship before Jerusalem was chosen as the solitary place of worship? So after the Israelites enter the Promised Land, the first place they encamp at later, like, is the initial headquarters, which I think is called Gibeon, and then it eventually shifts to Shiloh, I think in Joshua 17 or 18. And the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, was at Shiloh for, there's some debate about it, somewhere around 380 years or something like that. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 39, it says, and he left, that's talking about David, he left Zadok the priest and his brothers the priests before the tabernacle of the Lord in the high place that was at Gibeon. Now, the thing that's strange about that verse in that context is that in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16, David has brought the ark of the Lord back, or he had brought it to Jerusalem, and so that's becoming the place where God dwells. But at the end of the chapter, there's this other high place, and who is serving at this high place? Zadok. Like, you got priests serving at a high place. I thought high places were not supposed to be good places. Or in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2, the people were sacrificing at the high places, plural. However, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. So it appears to be the case that these high places that existed before Jerusalem was chosen as the place of worship were places that people did worship the true God. Are you guys aware that in the Old Testament, even in the southern kingdom of Judah, whenever there was kings that would not remove the high places, that those high places were oftentimes used to worship not just the pagan gods, but the true God? Like when King Manasseh does his repenting, and in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 17, it says, nevertheless, the people still sacrificed at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. So one of the, I think, mistakes that we make when we think about high places is, all right, first of all, were they okay before Jerusalem was chosen to be the place of worship? Well, where else would you worship? You had the one at Gibeon. You had other, 1 Samuel talks about some of these places where God allowed them to worship in some of these high places until a centralized place was chosen. And so we got examples of that in Chronicles. We got examples of that in Kings. We've got residuals of this in 2 Chronicles where people would worship the true God, but at the wrong place. Comments or questions about that? Yes? Yes, these were. From what I understand, it would be like topographically, like literally geographically high place, because the higher you got, people thought the higher you got, the closer you got to God. But do you guys see the issue here? Where do you worship before Jerusalem was chosen? It was tolerated prior to Jerusalem. There were high places. People. 1 Chronicles 16 has got 2 places of worship, and God seems to be okay with that in the meantime. But when Jerusalem is chosen, then there's only one place, and all the other high places, even if you are worshiping the true God, have become wrong. Yes?
When I think of John 4:24, when I see this, God is spirit, those who worship him, must worship him in spirit and truth. And that's a theme, I think it's all through the Bible, is your worship has to be true to God.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's not worship.
Well, and this creates a good lesson just about the high places, that, we're still worshiping the true God. We're just doing it at this high place over here. It's not Jerusalem, I know, but our hearts are right, and we're worshiping the same God you are. And all throughout the Old Testament, God says, nevertheless, they did not remove the high places. Nevertheless, they did not remove the high. Is God really so concerned about where you worship him? Apparently he is. And so even if it was one of the high places where Baal was not worshipped, but it was the true God. And I think that's one of those lesser-known things about the high places. Eventually, I might do a sermon on those ideas. But the reason that I'm bringing up this at the beginning of this class is because in Deuteronomy 12, God will say that there will eventually be a single place of worship. It's being predicted here. Jerusalem is not being named, and it's not going to happen until hundreds of years after this speech that Moses gives. So there will be eventually one place of worship, and until then, I guess God tolerated some of these other high places. And then the next section, if there's this one place to worship, you make sure you do not put anything above God. So you get 4 temptations to idolatry, 4 different things that could pull you into idolatry away from the one true God that you worship at this one place eventually that's chosen. So that's what we're looking at tonight. Any comments or questions just on where we're going here? All right. So we'll survey chapter 12, not read all of it. I do want to begin by reading chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, though, just to get us started with this. These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy the name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go. I read through verse 5, but all right. So verse 1 gives us this introductory thing about these statutes and these commands that Moses is going to be giving. There's some other verses that are kind of like that in Deuteronomy, and some of those verses are ones that people have said, well, it seems like Moses is starting a new sermon here, and that's why you get some debates about how many sermons he actually has. But he says in this verse that you need to be careful to do everything when you get into the land. It's assured to these people, you guys will get into the land. It's going to happen. And when this happens, you guys have this responsibility of purging the land of all the false worship centers. Where are the false worship centers in this text? Yeah, the mountains, the hills, the trees, you got them all over the place. And I want you to notice in these verses that God says you must not worship God in that way. Notice he's not saying you must not worship the false gods like they do. He says when you get into the land and you see all of these different high places all over the place, don't borrow what the pagans are doing and reinvent it to make it so you're worshiping like the true God that you apparently love. Don't borrow from how the world does it and then repackage it for your God. And there's all kinds of applications that we could make from that. Do we take our ideas from the world and then try to bring it in here in the way that we present things? Do sermons ever become like self-help talk where it's all about how if you reach deep inside of you, you have everything that it takes, and that's totally not at all what the Bible teaches? Like, do we let a lot of the world's way of trying to build people up become the way that we do this? Would be maybe one example of that. But one lesson from this too is that in every generation, idolatry is always around you. And there's this perpetual danger of borrowing things from the world because the world has prepackaged ideas. We baptize those ideas and then bring them in amongst God's people. And God says, you do not do that. And so instead, he says, look at all these verbs that they're supposed to do with all these things. Destroy, tear, dash, burn, chop. Do all of these violent kinds of things with all of these false worship centers. Is there a time and place to ever have this kind of emotion for the Christian today? Towards what? Yeah. Is this your attitude towards sin in your own life? Or do you ever have some of those sins that are kind of nice to keep there because you know that if you can pull out your anger and you can twist things the right way, you can get your way? So I'm just going to kind of keep that one there in case I ever need to use that again. Or I kind of like being able to go to my computer and looking those things up that I shouldn't be looking up, because generally I don't do that, but sometimes I get really stressed out and it's kind of fun to be able to do that from time to time. Do we have the attitude where we want to totally destroy, tear, dash, everything is gone? And maybe this is even the way that we should feel about false doctrine, obviously doing it with love, but we should be destroying every lofty opinion that's raised against the knowledge of Christ in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I don't know if I've mentioned this here before, but when I was a new Christian, I used to look at the older generation that would debate things. They would have debates on different doctrinal things. And I would look at that and go, how ugly that people would fight over doctrine. And now I look at it and go, why is it that my generation won't debate anything? Like, we're just too scared of being different from everybody else. We don't care enough about the truth that we would never actually think that that's a noble thing to debate truth. And so I think we should have those kinds of attitudes towards things that are against the Lord. And so this passage says a lot against religious pluralism. It says here that not all religions are witnesses to the truth. Not all religions are equally valid and eternally helpful. And this might seem narrow-minded to the world, but God is saying when you get into the land, this is your duty. Any comments or questions on any of that?
And even if you can take it a step further, even to the family, your family. Sometimes we have to draw a line even in our family to let our children know who we stand for and who we serve and what we plan to do with our lives as long as God gives us breath.
That's right. Drawing lines even in family sometimes. We're going to see that in chapter 13, starting around verse 6. And so, like he says, you're going to get into the land. Okay, great. You have to do this. If you want to get into the land and live in the land and have the joy that God wants you to have, you will not have peace until you battle. You want to have peace in your life, you've got to battle sin. You've got to get false ideas out of your heart. And so, once you do that, then God will choose this special place of worship, again, that's not named, but he's going to have this solitary place that they're going to bring their offerings, their tithes, their contributions. And there's this contrast in this text to all the places that the pagans worship at, plural in verse 2, which with the singular place that's brought up in verse 5, 11, 14, 18, 21. And in this place, look at verses 6 and 7. And there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. All right, so they're supposed to eat and rejoice here. Why does it say that they're supposed to eat at this location? What did you do with the peace offering, for example? did the worshipers eat from any of the sacrifices? Well, we got to study Leviticus. They ate from the peace offering. So if you were to bring a peace offering to the Lord, you'd bring your burnt offering, you'd bring your grain offering. The grain offering would be on top of the burnt offering. And then on top of that, or in addition to all of that, you'd bring a peace offering. And the right thigh would go to the priests, and then the worshiper would get the rest of that, and it would be something that you would eat at the temple. So in the Old Testament, at least up to this point, whenever you would eat meat, it was associated with worship to the Lord. Like the Passover meal is eating a lamb, that sort of thing. And so it's at this place that you shall eat. Now I say that this leads into the next section, because the next section is going to deal with, well, what about when God chooses this one place of worship and you really want to eat meat, but that temple is like 300 miles away? We're going to get to that question in just a second. And so he says to them about this one place, you have to stop doing what's right in your own eyes. They're like the generation in the book of Judges. So the rest of this chapter deals with killing non-sacrificial animals. So like, let's say you live far away from Jerusalem. You know that typically the way you eat meat is by the sacrifices that you give. So what do? Look at verses 15 and 16. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns as much as you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and as of the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water. All right, so if you want to eat meat and you don't live near the temple, what do? Yeah, you have at it, and there's a couple instructions about that. What are some of the instructions? Don't eat the blood. So there are certain animals that are not approved for sacrifice, like the gazelle or the deer. You can go ahead and hunt those. There's no problem with that. Have as much of it as you want. People who are clean or unclean can eat animals. I forgot to word that better. Actually, I'm sorry about that. But the idea of verse 15, the end of verse 15, the unclean and the clean may eat of it. That's referring to people that are ritually clean or ritually unclean. Go ahead and have whatever meat you want. This is not a sacrificial piece of meat. This is something that you're just wanting to eat. So it's okay to go ahead and have it. But you have to pour the blood on the earth. All right. You can't consume the blood in the Old Testament. Can you consume blood in the New Testament? No, you cannot. In Acts chapter 15, it's one of the laws that were written. It's one of the things that James in the Jerusalem meeting, they sent out this law. I think that's one of the things that does apply from the Old Testament also to the New. Christians are not supposed to eat blood. I don't think that means you can't have a medium rare steak, but you can't have like blood sausage. You can't drink the blood from a deer after you've killed your first deer like people did in Minnesota when I was growing up. I don't think that kind of thing is appropriate for a Christian. David?
No,
Ryan?
So verse 15, it said, you can eat basically whatever you want. Then he says, of the gazelle and the deer alike. What does that mean?
I think there's certain animals that are not that you can't bring and sacrifice at the temple, like the gazelle or the deer. So I think it's just a way of emphasizing when you eat meat in these places, this is not a sacrificial thing. You guys normally associate eating meat with sacrifices, but these are non-sacrificial animals. Go have at them. Now, you can't eat an unclean animal, but there's certain animals that God did not approve of as sacrificial animals that were not unclean, though. So, okay, so you see how granular and detailed this is. So, also, you're supposed to bring the sacrifices and the tithes to this location. They belong at the place of worship. Israel must not neglect the Levites as they do all of this. If you neglect the Levites and the Levites aren't getting their share from the work that you guys are doing, then you're going to starve out the people that are supposed to be helping you and all that sort of thing. And so that's just this prophecy that there's going to be this place that's going to be chosen. Any comments or questions on that? Because I want to spend most of our time on the dangers to idolatry. All right. So there are 4 temptations to committing idolatry in the rest of this. At the end of chapter 12, through the totality of chapter 13. And each one of these, I think, are pretty different from another. And there's a lot to say about each one of them. The first one is sinful curiosity. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, starting in verse 29. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, that I also may do the same? You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Okay. Is curiosity and asking questions like a good thing, generally? Like in our class on how to study the Bible, like if you're not asking questions about the Bible, you're not really trying to figure out what it says. And so curiosity is a really important thing, but how do you know when it becomes sinful? Yeah, if it's not something God has commanded and you're starting to partake in these things and you're trying to delve deeper into it, what else would we say? How curiosity can become sinful?
We become infatuated with what we see, and so then we want to say, okay, I can serve God this way, and we can't look at it that way. We got to look at it as God has said not to do it this way, and we got to turn from it.
Yeah. So you start wondering, like, hey, how did those other people do those things? Not because you want to know where they're coming from so you know how to help them out of it, but you're asking these questions so that you can go ahead and replicate and do what it is that they're doing. And so why do we sometimes become curious about wickedness? Yeah, you hear other people are doing things that they ought not be doing, and you're like, well, what is that all about? And have you ever known somebody that got a little too curious about some things that were wicked, and it started making them go deeper into things, and they should have just stopped asking that question? Yeah.
The lure of sin is attractive, else we wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
So that's what did it.
Right. So if this first temptation comes more from within ourselves. In this text, it also warns about how they even offer up their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Why is it bringing up that example of offering up your children? Like, you think when Moses is giving this speech, he says, don't inquire about how they do things. Don't wonder how they do things. They offer up their children. Well, Moses, I thought you just said don't ask about it, and you're just telling us some details about how they worship. Why is he bringing up such an extreme example of what they do? I think what he's saying here is you guys don't realize how serious sinful curiosity can become. You start asking how they do things, and at first you had no desire to offer up your children. But you start following these sinful lines of inquiry, asking all kinds of questions that you really shouldn't be asking because you've got a sinful kind of curiosity. It will take you places that you never thought you would go. And so, eventually you had King Ahaz, King Manasseh, who offered up their children as sacrifices. I like what Paul says in Romans 16:19. I want you to be wise as to what is good and innocent as to what is evil. So we have to ask ourselves the questions, what do you read? What do you watch? What do you seek to learn about? What are the things that you're curious about? And are they the right things? And any comments or questions on any of that?
There are things that, this just takes society, not the church, that in my younger life would be considered so abhorrent that they wouldn't ever be talked about and let alone tolerated anywhere, such as what's going on in society now with the drag queen shows in front of kids, and you know what I'm talking about, stuff of that nature. But
Right.
I worked for the University of Kentucky for 32 years. They at one time said, oh, now this lifestyle, we have to tolerate. You have to be tolerant. And then in a few years, now you have to accept it. And then in a few more years,
You have to praise it.
you have to celebrate it.
Right.
You see, the progression that happens here, kind of like Deuteronomy 1. And so,
And then you got other people saying,
that can happen in the church too.
well,
I can remember in my lifetime when the denominations around us preached against and condemned mixed dancing and dances and stuff. That was sin. Now they're holding it within their buildings and stuff. So we have to be careful and guard ourselves against this frog in the water.
yeah, the boiling frog.
Where we become accustomed to it and it no longer shocks us or bothers us.
Right. Good.
The Bible still says, have no fellowship with them who work darkness.
Right.
But rather,
Expose them.
expose them.
Yep. All right. Anything else on that? All right. So if you're sinfully curious, your takeaway is to stop doing that. All right. The second one that can lead to idolatry is false prophets. So look at chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and hold fast to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. All right. So in this second one, you've got this scenario where a prophet comes with a sign, a wonder, fulfilled prophecy. It says that he's a dreamer. Maybe he claims that he had some kind of dream about something. And he wows everybody with his charisma or something. And then he tells everybody, let's go worship these other gods. And you got this idea that it's these gods that you do not know, and there's this appeal to worshiping these new gods. So this new guy comes to town, and he's got all these really interesting ways of talking about this dream that I had. And this dream showed me that all of you have been worshiping the wrong way, but if you come and listen to me, then you'll do it the right way. And everybody that's shallow goes, wow, he had a dream. And he said that he saw it. What's the response that you should have?
Don't believe it. Take action against it.
Yeah. Do not listen to him. Well, that's narrow-minded. Well, that's what God said. He said, do not listen to him. And in fact, what God is doing is he is testing them to see what their response is. God, could he have just zapped that guy before he ever got to that village or that city? Yeah, but he's letting them go in there and going, all right, let's see how my people respond to this guy. The sensation of being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine that comes along, how does that feel being on a boat that's just rocking back and forth? Do you like that kind of idea? Well, have you ever been that person or seen Christians that every new idea that comes along, that's interesting. Well, that's interesting. God's testing you to see do you love what you've seen in the Scripture? The antidote for both of these, sinful curiosity and going after a false prophet, is why can't you just be satisfied with what the Scriptures say? Why do you have to go and learn all the false ways that everybody does everything? It's certainly not because you're trying to evangelize to them. It's because you've got a sinful curiosity. Or why do you have to go after every charismatic thing that you hear that's not rooted in the Bible? Can't you just be satisfied with the Scriptures? So don't listen to them. And what ultimately does God say? By the way, no sign or miracle, no alleged sign or miracle has any priority over what the Scriptures teach, is what he's saying. If you know people that say, well, I know a lot of people that saw such and such kind of sign or miracle, and they said that they saw it, and don't you believe in eyewitness testimony? Well, if it goes against the Scripture, I don't believe it. And I'm commanded to not listen to it. David?
It's like someone inviting us to drink poison to see if it'll work,
Yeah.
and you don't drink poison.
Whenever I've gotten that invitation, I've said no every time. So, I think I have. What are you supposed to do with this guy? What different versions might say something different. Mine says, purge the evil from your midst. Put to death. So that's the first time that we see this idea of purging evil from your midst. These are the references in Deuteronomy that talk about that. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where you've got the guy sleeping with his father's wife, I think a stepmother, that would be a stepmother probably. When it says in that text, purge the evil from your midst, it's quoting these passages in Deuteronomy. That when you've got this evil that's spreading amongst the Israelites, you don't tolerate it, you get it out. Any comments or questions on that?
This is like any sickness in our body. It's like cancer. We have to get rid of that, or else it's going to destroy the whole body.
Yep.
Eric?
Yep.
When the Mormon church started, with the whole deal with Golden Tablet and all that, some of the first people that he got into that were members of the Church of Christ.
Yeah. Yep. Good. Any other thoughts or comments on this? Yep.
When it says that the dreamers, like, when it actually came true, do you think God is letting that come true to test it?
Yeah, this is a good question. So when it says that sign or wonder tells you you should listen to the words of prophet, dreamer dreams. If these things come to pass, is God letting these things come to pass to test them? I think so. It's like the witch of Endor, who, like, she's surprised when Samuel is summoned. Like, oh, wow, I didn't know I could do that. Or the Jannes and Jambres, the two magicians in Pharaoh's court. The first couple plagues they're able to replicate. And people have tried to find all kinds of naturalistic ways how they're doing that. I think God's letting them do that to test the people. Were you going to say something?
When Moses and when Aaron put the rod down, it turned to a snake, and Pharaoh's magicians did likewise, but God made a distinction between the two because that serpent ate up the rest of them. So God
Right.
laid it down that his word was really the truth.
Right, and then when they multiplied like more water to become blood, it's like, well, thanks, you guys aren't even helping really. Like it seems like you're more on God's side than Pharaoh's. All right, the third one is friends and family. Look starting in verse 6. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your friend, who is as your own soul entices you secretly, saying, let us go and serve gods which neither you nor your fathers have known, some of the gods of the peoples who are around you, whether near or far off from you, from one end to the earth to the other. You shall not yield to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him, nor shall you conceal him, but you shall kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. You shall stone him to death with stones, because he sought to draw you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And all Israel shall hear and fear and never again do any such wickedness as this among you. All right. So in this scenario, what's the difference between the false prophet and this one? Yeah, this is your family. So like maybe as I'm surmising this, the previous temptation, you're really attracted to the charisma of somebody. Here, it's like, this is family and I don't want to upset anybody. And like this is a little different. And what's the argument that they're coming up with to go commit this idolatry? Like what are they saying? Yeah. Like they're secretly saying, and like there's these gods that nobody knows. Again, there's this newness kind of factor to all of this. Like you got some family member, friend, like your brother, hey, like mom and dad don't have to know. Those priests over there, they don't have to know. Like we'll just go at nighttime. We'll go out and we'll worship those false gods. We won't tell it to anybody. But it's going to be really fun for some reason. Solomon failed in this when his wives turned his heart away from the Lord. But if you've got some family member or a friend coming to you and doing this, what struck you about the response that you ought to have to this?
It's very plain.
Yeah.
There's no him and hawing.
No, there's no just maybe give them a couple more months or a couple more years, and it would be just kind of actually more convenient to just not think about it and just pretend like the conversation never happened. It says you should kill him. Don't yield. First of all, don't yield. Don't fall to the peer pressure that they're bringing to you. Don't conceal him either. This is really interesting. There's a preacher friend of mine who had a son that was living in sin. And the father came to the son and said, okay, you've been baptized, you're a Christian, apparently, and you're supposed to be living the way that God has asked you to live, and I've confronted you about this and you're not repenting. So I think what I'm going to have to do is bring it to the church, and I'm going to announce it from the pulpit that you're continuing to live in sin. To your own son, you'd rat them out? What about in a local church, if there's somebody that's on the way to becoming an elder, and the wife knows this man is not qualified? What should she do? Go tell it on the, no, don't tell it on the mountain. Go tell the people that need to know that this guy doesn't have the qualities, and I live with him, and I know that he's not anything that these passages say he ought to be. And so there's this challenge to be partial with family members, but if you're showing partiality in these kinds of ways, it's to the detriment of everybody else around you. And so this person has to be stoned, and who's the first one to chuck a stone? The accuser. That was the law in the Old Testament. The first person to throw a stone is the person who is the accuser, which is why Jesus says the thing in John chapter 8, let he who is without sin among you cast the first stone. And so he's trying to get them to follow the law, which they're not following in other areas. All right. Notice, though, that just enticing other people triggers this judgment. It's not like, well, we had that conversation. We did not do it. I told him to stop talking about that sort of thing. It's just the enticement alone that says, okay, you have to be killed. Look at the standards of God. Do we as fellow Christians ever pull each other into watching movies we shouldn't watch or going and doing certain things that we ought not be doing? In the Old Testament, you should die for that. That's legal law because it was a theocracy. Of course, Christians don't have the right to execute people. But the point that I'm making is, do you see how serious God takes this? Any thoughts or comments on that? Can you imagine having to rat out your wife? Maybe it's like you didn't really want to be married to her anymore anyways, and it was convenient that she did that. But can you imagine if you had a good marriage, and she comes up to you and says, hey, I heard some cool things about Molech, and maybe we should try it out. And he's like, okay, you're going to have to die. This is what God expected. Comments or questions on that? Right. And if there's any part of us that goes, ooh, that's just too much, it's not because God is guilty. It's because my heart has been too much influenced by whatever our culture says is love. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Curse God and die. Yeah, so would Job's wife, maybe. I think this is before the law was given officially, or at least codified, although he seems to be doing a lot of things that the law would have said. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure on Job, on the situation with Job. Because it's not like go worship a false god. It's saying stop worshiping the true God or something. So, yeah.
Certainly we're glad for the mercy of God, and those physical stoning and death don't apply for us, but if we can point out sin, if our family member goes off into that, and if we can stand up to it and say, we're not doing this. Well, it might hurt, but in the long run, guess what? God plans work. It'll help.
Right.
Because that person will know for sure that we gotta be like Joshua. We gotta be able to draw a line in the sand and say, as for me and my house, guess what? We're gonna serve God.
Right.
And that applies to everybody, and that applies certainly to me.
Yep.
And that's what we have to do as Christians.
Good.
If we're gonna be saved.
Right. All right, so the last temptation to idolatry is cultural movements. This is the way I'm characterizing it, but look at verses 12 and 13. If you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to dwell there, that certain worthless fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you have not known. And then it's going to tell them what to do. But you start out with this hearing rumors that there's this city that's been turned to God. Like it's the way that this whole part of the country is starting to think about things. And you got these influencers that have gone out, and they're called worthless fellows. These people that are stirring up these people to worship all the false things and whatever. I like what Exodus 23 verse 2 says. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil. And it seems like there's this city that's taking a lot of traction towards this false way of worship, and the danger would be that people see a lot of people in this, and I don't want to be left out. And so the response to all of this is that you have to inquire and confirm that this is indeed happening. Even a faint rumor requires that you have to go investigate it. Don't wait until it becomes widely known. Like as soon as you hear something about it, go and investigate. And if it's true, what do you do? Yeah, this is like you're treating them like they're the Canaanites that have to be conquered. Which shows you God has never been racist against the Canaanites. This has never been God hates a certain race of people, because you have his own people potentially doing all the things that those other people did, and they're being treated the same way that they treated the Canaanites before them. And so can you see ways in which Christians latch on to cultural movements and it causes them to put things above God? Like the culture has said, hey, like we should care about X, Y, or Z, and then we reinterpret the scripture to go, actually, I can find 5 or 6 passages that I can twist in such a way that makes it seem like this should be the thing that I care about more than anything else. And my prediction, if I can say this without getting crucified, is that I think in the next few years, there's going to be a lot of brethren that jump on the bandwagon that we've got to save the planet. When the Bible says in seed time or harvest, it's always going to remain, and we are not powerful enough to destroy it. I'm not saying that we should intentionally be destroying a bunch of things or whatever. That's not. But should that ever become what you think God has given you as your most important mission? I guarantee you there's going to be brethren in the next 5 years that are going to make that their most important mission. And they're going to twist certain scriptures to say this is what my life is all about. Because I've looked at how the Israelites went into the land of promise, and they weren't supposed to destroy the fruit trees. There's the verse. Any comments or questions on that?
Man is guaranteed to come up with a lot of different things, but as for us, as for serving God, we got to stay true to his word, and that'll stave off anything that'll come along if we just go with that.
Yes.
Like the FBI, they don't study every counterfeit that's out there. They study money, and when one has $100 bill, they know what that looks like. When you bring one in there that's not, they can pick it off. And that's the same way we got to be with studying and knowing the word. When any false doctrine come along, if we've been in the book, we'll know it.
Yep.
We can know it.
And the end of this section says that they have to let this city remain a heap forever. Last thing, Psalm 106, 34 to 36. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mixed with the nations and learned to do as they did. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They did not listen to the things that Moses told them to do here. Let that be a lesson for all of us. All right, thanks, guys.